Um, a year ago, I published this book, which will appear in a minute, with three other women. And in it, we talk a lot about familiar species of plants, but we try to find something new and exciting to say about them. And we do that by drawing on the combination of arts and humanities and science. But the shameful truth is that behind this facade of learning, I am actually a terrible botanist. And it's not that I don't love plants. I do. I got that love from this man. This is my dad, and he's sitting over there. He's a really good botanist. He's much better than I'll ever be. And as a child, I used to sit on the floor while he would sit at the dining room table and patiently work through keys and cribs and irritate my mum by scattering seeds and dirt all over the place. And he taught me the names of hundreds of species, but I was too young and too impatient to really sit down with him and learn how to identify them properly. Instead, I knew plants by how they looked, how they felt, how they smelled, how they tasted in some cases, by what more advanced botanists like you lot might call their jizz. But if someone had asked me to justify my identification, I couldn't provide any meaningful account of how and why I knew an individual belonged to a species. I did have a copy of Rose, but it sat on my shelf in an embarrassingly clean state. So, plant blindness is a term that's often used to describe people who are unable to notice or register plants. And those afflicted with this terrible condition just can't see the difference between botanical species. They'll go to a species-rich grassland and see just a field of unvaried green. Now, I'm not sure you could go so far as to say I had plant blindness, but maybe I had a form of plant cataracts. The more I read about plants, though, for the book, the more I came to realize how much I was missing. And that's why I decided to study Identiplant. Learning to be more systematic, though, was challenging at first. I did approach some of the earlier tasks in the course with a smidge of resentment. What is the point of writing a key, I thought, to iris, tulip, snowdrop and daffodil? A 5-year-old child can tell the difference between these. So why was I being forced to study these weird opposed couplets of characteristics instead of just going straight to the right page of the book? But as the course went on, I realised that the mystery of botanical keys was actually an education in an art of subtle differentiation. What I was being taught was a matter of perception, of paying heed to differences that I had formerly overlooked. And I was lucky to have a brilliant Identiplant teacher, a man called Jerry Firkins. And as I moved through family after family with Jerry's help, plants that had looked the same suddenly sprang into view as entirely separate species. And I became aware of new complexities, so many eclectic eyebrights. And don't even get me started on the complexities of water crowfoot. I felt humbled by the detail that I'd formerly overlooked, but also excited by this new world of curiosities. But I also had a growing sense of unease in a way. In my day job, I'm what they call an interdisciplinary academic. And that's just a posh way of saying that you're a jack of all trades and master of none. So I'm interested in ecology, which is obviously a science. I'm interested in the way places are made in the process of urban development, and that's a social science. And I'm interested in conflicts over the value and the beauty of nature, which falls into the arts and humanities. And as I came to the end of Identiplant, I started to wonder, could I use my newfound botanical knowledge to investigate the relationship of the urban planning system to nature? Now, as many of you will know, far better than I do because it's your day job, the place of ecology in the planning system is changing. This year, the government introduced a new policy called biodiversity net gain. So when a planning application is being put together, the developer will employ an ecologist to go to a site and map and survey it. And their assessment of the habitats that are present there is largely based on plant communities. So botany is the major skill set for this. And they put the data into a spreadsheet like this, and that calculates the number of biodiversity units that a site provides. And the developer's plans need to incorporate ecological enhancements that increase that number by 10%. And when they get planning permission, it comes with a series of conditions, and they're a bit like a promise. The developer will sign up to do X, Y, and Z to get that 10% biodiversity increase. But here is the catch. All these figures, they all exist on spreadsheets and on maps. And a lot of very important, very influential people have spent a lot of time and energy making sure the calculation works. And a lot of academics have written very long articles about how this should all work in theory. But at the other end of the system, which is the one that deals with real life, there's precious little in the way of enforcement of planning conditions. It's as though everybody has become so absorbed by the calculations and the spreadsheet that nobody is really going out and looking at what developers are doing on the ground. So this summer, I decided to go out and see how many of the ecological mitigation and enhancement measures that developers have promised on plans were actually there. And with two colleagues, including Professor Malcolm Tate, who's also sitting over there, I went to 42 new build housing estates in 5 areas of England. And we looked at 6,000 houses, over 291 hectares of land. We searched for nearly 5,000 trees and the best part of 1,000 bird and bat boxes. What an exciting summer. And we just explored hectares of land that was supposed to be wildflower grassland or ponds or hedgerows. And here's when my Identiplant skills came in handy, because a lot of the enhancement measures involved the creation of things like grasslands or woodland edge areas. And one of the skills I now needed was to be able to tell whether the species mix that I could see on site was roughly right for the habitat that was supposed to be provided. And so my training in noticing differences suddenly became really important. I can't give you all of the detail of what I found yet because the report hasn't yet been released. It's going to come out published by Wild Justice shortly. But the headline figure is that 50% of the stuff that's supposed to be there is missing. And on the worst developments, almost nothing is in place. And plants are especially affected. There are so-called wildflower meadows that are supposed to be created. They're actually just amenity grass mixes in real life. And I don't mean the nice flowering lawn ones. I mean grasslands that offer very little in the way of ecosystem support. But this is not just about the work that I'm doing. The work that you are all doing really matters too. The botanical records that you're creating are, of course, scientifically significant, but they're also really practically and socially important within the planning system. Remember that I said that when a planning system application comes in, an ecologist does a survey of the site, well, that involves a historical record check. They'll contact the local environmental record centre, which gives us a rather ominous sounding acronym, LERC, and they'll see what species have previously been recorded there on site. But to state the obvious, if your data isn't there, it won't be picked up. And unfortunately, the infrastructure for records is a bit of a mess nationally right now. It's very underfunded, it's very fragmented, and a lot of councils don't necessarily appreciate the importance of what LERCs are doing. So please don't assume that because you've submitted your records to one body, they'll necessarily be shared with the LERC. Practice on this varies wildly between places. So here's an example of how it can go wrong. It's a Lepidoptera example, but please don't excommunicate me for that. This is on a site near me. The Wildlife Trust had records for a dingy skipper butterfly colony. They'd been submitted to the local LERC, but they hadn't been uploaded. And a developer came knocking for this site, and the ecologist checked the records, and there was no mention of dingy skippers. So the developer got permission to build. There was no planning condition to protect these butterflies or to create new habitat for them. So this shows how important data is. Your record could be the thing that prevents a local extinction. So please, please, if you do one thing, please keep submitting those lovely records, lots and lots of them. And of course, send them to the BSBI, but please make sure that they're reaching your local work and that someone there is able to process them, that they've got the resources and capacity to do that. So what about the future? Well, I'm going to be continuing this work. I'm part of a research team who've won a large 3-year grant to look at the interface between planning and nature. And we're going to quantify the habitat and biodiversity loss that is associated with urban development. And we're going to find the points of failure where systems to protect nature fall over. So if you're interested in this work, please do get in touch with me. I would love to hear from you. For now, though, I just want to say a huge thank you to the BSBI, to the Identiplant team, and to Chantal, who does such a great job of organising everyone. The course has not only introduced me to the art of noticing differences, but to this amazing, welcoming and friendly community. And in a world where things can seem very dark and despairing at times, organisations like the BSBI are a really important source of light. And together in this room and out there in the country, we have a vast amount of expertise for the natural world. So let's use it to protect the places and the plants that matter.
Kiera, that is one of the best pleas for open data that I've heard for years. That was wonderful. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Does anybody have questions for Kiera? I expect everyone wants to know the exact results.
Yeah. Soon, I promise.
Make sure you put your hands up nice and straight so I can actually see you. Thank you very much.
So interesting to hear your talk.
Like a rock star.
Like this. Hello.
Hi.
Your talk was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask, so I went to a Q Mutual Improvement Society talk a little while ago, and the two women, I've forgotten their names now, but they went to Cape Town, and they went to a lot of areas in South Africa, and they were looking at these wonderful areas and doing lots of surveys on like the ground flora and fauna that they were finding. And I was wondering, what do you suggest for countries like South Africa? Because like I feel like they have a lot of trouble because there's so many plants, and it's kind of a struggle to find out about all of them before the area completely vanishes. I was wondering, what do you think countries like South Africa could be doing to like help sustain those ecological systems and biodiversity?
Oh my goodness, I know almost nothing about South African botany or urban development, I'm afraid. What I would say is obviously recording, wherever you are, record. That's really important. Train more people to do that recording. That's really important. In terms of urbanization, obviously there's, we do need to house people in nice standards of housing. But I think we do really need to be aware of the impacts that urbanization, and particularly things like roads, create on nature. And I think we're not always, all across the world, we're not building housing in the most sensible way at all. We're building it in the most profitable way. And those things are different. And we need to make it so that those things line up a lot more than they currently do everywhere.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, no, it's okay. Go ahead.
Thank you for that. I've got two parts to my question. One is, you said 50% of the mitigation wasn't applied. Was there any particular pattern of types of mitigation that were failed to implement? And the second part is there any penalty inflicted on the developer when they fail to implement these mitigations?
Yes, there is a pattern, is the short answer. Some of the more visible things like street trees tend to be present a bit more than some of the things like grasslands. Grasslands are in a particularly bad state, hedges are in a particularly bad state. And there's a problem with the maintenance of these places as well as the creation of them. Sorry, what's the second part of the question? Penalties. Yes. This is the really big problem. There's no enforcement. There are planning enforcement teams, but they are so understaffed that they can only really deal with people kind of doing crazy, insane things. and ecology isn't prioritized within them. We need a much, much better planning enforcement system to sort this out.
So I was wondering, a lot of the biodiversity net gain interventions are focused on specific taxonomic groups like birds and bats and plants.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether certain understudied taxonomic groups are getting left behind, because particularly, well, birds and bats are iconic species, but they're a very small part of biodiversity. And I guess as fundamental as plants are to terrestrial ecosystems, they're also a relatively small part of biodiversity compared to arthropods and fungi.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if those are getting left behind by the system.
Yeah, I mean, inverts in particular, right, so critical to the kind of ecosystem. And my colleague at Oxford, Natalie Duffus, is doing some amazing work on how BNG just neglects inverts completely. You're absolutely right. You know, any framing that you have like BNG that's sort of on the spreadsheet is going to inevitably end up prioritizing certain things. And I think it's really important that we don't let that be the sole logic, that we keep remembering that this is like an approximation and that there may be all kinds of cases where it doesn't work that well. And this is why it concerns me a lot that we're removing discussion about biodiversity from the planning system, because actually communities have an awful lot of knowledge about ecology. We're all a community. We are all part of the community. And we need to make sure that, you know, where there is something really special that's, say, brownfield, or that's not kind of, or you know, grey belt, they're now calling it grey belt. Some of those environments are really, really valuable ecologically. We need to make sure that they're not being destroyed just automatically because some spreadsheet says that they're not valuable. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kiera.
No
We'll be here. So we've just heard from Kiera how important Identiplant was to her coming to the important work that she's done and the change that she's effecting and will effect in the future to our planning system. But we're really delighted today to be joined by Brenda Harold, who's the woman who devised Identiplant and ran it for a decade. And last year, invited BSBI to continue this amazing journey on plant identification, where we now administer Identiplant, but are completely dependent upon Brenda for having started it at all. So I'd like to invite Brenda, Chantal Helm, who's the BSBI training coordinator who manages the program, and BSBI Chief Executive Julia Hammer to the stage, please.